Morning everybody, welcome to Tuesday's Indycar. My name's Gordon Ross. Today I'm in Maryhill, one of my favourite places to broadcast from. And today's subject is Britishness. What is it? Why is it important? Or is it important at all? And is it even a thing? Well, those of you who remember the past independence referendum back in 2014 will remember that there was a heavy emphasis placed on whether we feel British or not. I don't know if you remember this. It struck me as odd at the time that the British response to the first Indy Ref campaign was to start buying on about being British, feeling British, having British connections, and this sense of Britishness was pushed quite heavily during the first Indy Ref campaign by Better Together. And at the time, I don't think I or many of the rest of us really understood the significance of what the Better Together campaign was trying to achieve by doing this. But the point of the matter is that for 300 years, the only thing that's really held Scotland and England together has been this illusion of Britishness, this narrative that we're all in it together, that together we make a stronger, cohesive whole, and that we are in fact, pardon me, we are in fact all part of the same team. And World War II tended to cement that even more in place, because the country had to unite to defend itself against the scourge of Nazism. And for once in the history of the British state, that was the one time when Britishness actually, I think, meant something, when we were all fighting together as one nation, if you like, to defeat Nazism, because we were basically surrounded by it. We were an island fortress. However, since the war, things changed dramatically, and the idea of Britishness was heavily promoted in the 1950s, even down to the part where in the 1960s we started to nationalise industries. We had British steel, British Leyland, British rail, British milk, British eggs, British potatoes, you name it, it was all British. And the heavy emphasis on Britishness became a part of daily life, to the point where most of the older generation that we know today, who are now retired, still think of themselves as British, because that was the way they grew up. They grew up in a country which was heavily British, and everybody thought of themselves as that. Yes, they were Scottish, but that was secondary to them. What was more important to them was this cohesiveness that they felt during the war and since the war. Since the war, however, other things have happened, and as we know, thousands of people from all over the Commonwealth were asked to come to the UK freely of their own volition, but invited here to help rebuild the country after the ravages of World War II. And so they came from all over the globe, but primarily most of these young men, as it was at the time, mostly young men, women too, but they came over later. Most of these young men came over from the Caribbean nations, or the Caribbean islands, former colonies of the UK. They did also come from places like India, Bangladesh and Pakistan, and maybe some other places too, but the point was predominantly they were coming from the Caribbean to help rebuild the UK. And these are known as the Windrush generation, as you probably heard on the news recently. But the problem with the Windrush generation was that once they had done what they were asked to do, rebuilding the country, they were deliberately shut out of society after that. They were marginalised, and even by the Labour Party most recently, who shredded all the documentation that allowed these poor people to prove that they were in the UK legitimately and that they were British citizens who had maybe even fought in the war, but also rebuilt the country afterwards. And we now know that that whole generation of people were largely, well, deliberately marginalised by the British state, had their documents shredded and became non-people. Some of them, many thousands of them, have even been deported. So this jars badly with this whole idea of Britishness, in inverted commas. The British when you're useful, basically. You're British when you're useful to the state. And then after that, you're another minority that they can cast aside. How this relates to Scotland is more complicated, because Scotland's had a lot longer to be inculcated with this Britishness, to be mind wiped and turned into British subjects. We've had 3 centuries of conditioning to undo. And it's very hard to fight against an idea, as we know. Ideas do not die, memes don't die, and a meme is just an idea. Sometimes it's a visual representation of an idea. But the battle, as far as I can see, in the minds of the voters of Scotland, is a battle between this feeling of Britishness on one hand, and this feeling of not just Scottishness, but this feeling of being badly treated, ignored and marginalised. In other words, having been used, told you were British, and then used until your usefulness was gone, and then all of a sudden you were worthless. But in Scotland it's more complicated than that even as well, because our usefulness as British people is largely limited to what we provide to the UK in terms of cash. It's what we earn that's important to the British state, not our Britishness. It's not us as people that are important. And to fight against the idea of Britishness, if you were to speak to somebody in their 70s or their 80s, they will probably tell you that they do feel British, because they do, because they grew up at a time when that is exactly how they felt. That's how they were treated, that's how they were identified, and the British state made them feel that way. It's very difficult for them to stop being British. And so I would say they're probably a lost generation to the independence campaign, because we can't convert those people. It's not fair. They feel British, they were British, and they can't stop thinking of themselves that way. The only thing that we can do really is not so much fight against the idea of Britishness, but ask ourselves not so much what have the British ever done for us, but ask what the British are doing to us now, what the British state is now doing to Scottish people. And what the British state is now doing to Scottish people is saying that we don't matter. Despite the fact that we voted not to come out of the European Union, and we voted in every single constituency in a majority not to leave the European Union. Despite all of that, the so-called British state is going to make sure that we don't stay in the EU, that we don't have our customs union, and they're going to make sure that they have ruined our economy. All this to be sacrificed on the altar of Britishness, that this cosy idea of nostalgic Britain, this roses round the door wartime idyll where everybody's pulling together and we're all digging for victory. This is nonsense. This isn't the 21st century. That's a complete fantasy land. But that's the Britishness that we're being asked to believe in at the moment. So if you set aside that whole Britishness argument and look at the reality of life in the 21st century, what you can see is you're staring down the barrel of ruin for the whole of the United Kingdom, not just for Scotland. And because of that, and because of the fact that we've now been marginalised, the Windrush generation are now the Bums Rush generation. They've been thrown out of the country. They've been marginalised, forgotten about, they've had their documents torn up, their usefulness is at an end. Sod off, back to your own country, you're no longer British. That's the attitude of the British state. And that's the kind of Britishness that we have in the 21st century. The one where black people are abused in the street, the one where Muslims are abused in the street, the one where Jews are abused on the street, the one where there is intolerance around every single corner. Plus the institutionalised racism against Scotland. The so-called jokes about us being jocks, about being stingy, about being mean, about being drunk, about being violent. All these racial stereotypes come floating back to the surface in the British mindset. And Scots are marginalised yet again. We've outlived our usefulness, we've provided them with a lot of oil. As far as they're concerned, that's all that interests the British state, is the oil. The oil and the gas to help them survive the idiotic decision that they have forced the country into. So when we're looking at campaigning on doorsteps, I would suggest that we avoid anybody over the age of 80 unless they have come out and said, I'm going to vote yes. If you canvass people at the door and they say, yes, I'm going to vote yes, brilliant. If they look at you as though you've come from Mars, walk away, because you're never going to convert them. And many of these people cannot think of themselves as anything other than British. When you look at British TV as well, the British Broadcasting Corporation. There's been a lot of argument online recently about Hardeep Singh Kohli's comments about the BBC having a blacklist. Various comments were made accusing Hardeep of some kind of misdemeanour at the BBC, and he left under a cloud. But regardless of whether that's true or not, nobody with a pro-independent stance who's prepared to say that on television ever gets a job at the BBC. They'll never be heard. We know that. All the people who campaign on behalf of Scotland for independence, for Scotland to leave the Union, will never get a voice on the BBC, for the simple reason that the BBC cannot allow it. We now know that MI5 has been vetting BBC staff members since before World War II. In fact, since before even 1933, MI5 was vetting the staff members of the BBC, right the way down to the cleaners and the electricians. And so that cosy relationship, or that strange relationship where we've got the Secret Service working within the British state media, means that nobody who has any support for independence will ever have their voice heard on the BBC. It just will not happen, because the British state cannot allow a Scottish voice to be heard. You'll notice, and I noticed over the years, that in BBC Scotland you get an endless parade of different weather people from all different parts of the UK. You'll get Welsh people, you'll get English people, Caribbean people, Indian people. And this is all part of this illusion of Britishness, this inclusive, multiracial Britain that the BBC is trying to mythologise. It doesn't exist. The Windrush generation proves it doesn't exist. The anti-Semitism in England proves it doesn't exist. The anti-Islamic Islamophobia means it doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. The British state has become a right-wing, racist place. It's deeply unpleasant. It's very far from the British state that those older people recognised from World War II. It just isn't that anymore. It's now a racist, whites-only, let's close the door to Johnny Foreigner English state. It's nothing to do with being British. You know and I know that Scotland welcomes people from all over the world every single year to come and live here. We welcome them as new Scots, and we have done that since time immemorial. We don't see any distinction between one Scot and another. Whoever chooses to live here and live our way of life and accept our standards, our attitudes to things, is a Scot as far as we're concerned. So we have to stop worrying about Britishness and start defining what Scottishness is, because when in the war of ideas, one idea is always compared to another. The British state is tainted and ugly, shrivelled black version of its former self. The Scottishness of people has never been smeared in that way. It can't be, because we hold ourselves to a much higher standard than that. And we wouldn't permit the right wing or the fascist or the racist to get a grip up here. And I hope that we never do. And when we're fighting for our independence, we need to just make sure that when people say they feel British, we remind them what British means in the 21st century. And we remind them what Scottish means in the 21st century. They are very different things. And the more this century goes by and the further we go down the Brexit road, the more these things deviate, the more Britishness veers off to the right and Scottishness stays on its leftward path. We're inclusive, progressive, reasonable people. We're kind, we welcome others, we tolerate whoever comes into the country. We help them set up here, we make them our friends and our neighbours. Our children go to school with their children. There's no segregation, there's no gulags, there are no no-go areas. And that's the secret of being Scottish instead of British. It's that mindset that we have to promote. And that's the difference between the British state that I want to come out of and the Scottish state that I want to live in the future. And I want my children and my grandchildren to continue to live in into the future. Those are the ideas for today. Something worth thinking about when you're campaigning. See you later. Bye for now.